It is a sweltering July afternoon in 1659, and Rome has turned out to watch 5 women hang. The square is Campo de' Fiori, the same stretch of cobblestones where, 6 decades earlier, the city burned a philosopher for insisting the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. Today, the crowd isn't here for cosmology. They're here because a psychic named Gironima Spana and 5 other women are about to be executed for running what the city has decided was an empire of poison, a quiet, patient, distinctly feminine empire, built out of small glass bottles that looked exactly like something you'd rub on your face. Somewhere in that crowd, a gossip turns to his neighbor and says something that will outlive every court document from the trial. Rome has just survived a plague. Convenient timing, he suggests. Convenient enough that the poison may have quietly finished off 500 husbands and everyone simply blamed the epidemic. Nobody checked his math. Nobody really ever has. Which is, as it turns out, the entire problem with this story, and also, weirdly, the most interesting part of it. Because what you're about to hear is usually told as a tidy little legend, one brilliant vengeful woman named Giulia Tofana, one secret recipe, 600 dead husbands, one dramatic unmasking. It has been repeated for 350 years in almost exactly that shape. And according to the historian who spent years reading the actual 1,450-page transcript of this case, a document the Vatican kept quietly locked away for 3 centuries, apparently worried the recipe itself might leak, almost none of it happened quite the way it's usually told. Which raises the question we're actually going to spend the next hour on. Not, did a woman poison 600 men, but what happens when a story is more useful to everyone than the truth is, and it just keeps getting told anyway? Let's start at the beginning, or at least at the beginning everyone agrees on. Here's a detail that tends to get skipped in the first 30 seconds of every retelling of this story, right before the narrator gets to the poison. In 16th century Italy, a woman did not really choose her husband, could not meaningfully divorce him, and had almost no legal standing independent of him once the wedding was over. That's not scene setting, that's the entire mechanism this story runs on. Marriage, for most women of the period, was arranged, often as a financial transaction between families, sealed with a dowry that functioned less like a gift and more like a down payment on a business merger. Once married, a woman's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. Her property, in practice if not always in law, became his to manage. Her movement, her friendships, often even her mail could be controlled by him. The Catholic Church, which had enormous authority over both public and private life in Rome, did not permit divorce. Annulment existed, technically, but required grounds that were narrow, expensive, and almost impossible for an ordinary woman to prove. So, picture the actual dilemma. You are, say, 22 years old. Your husband gambles away what little money the household has. Or he's violent and everyone on your street knows it, and nobody intervenes because intervening in a marriage was considered exactly as socially acceptable as intervening in someone else's business ledger. Or he has syphilis, which was extraordinarily common in this period, and he is going to die slowly and take you and any future children down with him financially. Your options, as far as the law is concerned, are endure it, or convince your family to take you back, which, given the dowry they've already paid out, most families were reluctant to do. There was, unofficially, a third option, and it came in a bottle that looked like face cream. Fast fact. Widowhood, for many women in this period, was one of the only life stages in which they gained meaningful legal and financial independence, the ability to control property, run a household, or remarry on their own terms. Which means an entire, very dark economic logic sat quietly underneath a lot of these poisonings. Historians of the period even had a blunt name for slow poisons of this kind. They called them inheritance powders. Nobody was writing pamphlets openly advocating murder, obviously, but everyone understood the arithmetic. A dead husband solved several problems that a living husband, no matter how monstrous, legally could not. Into that gap walked a product. The first solid paper trail we have for anything resembling this poison comes from Palermo, Sicily, in 1632 or 1633, a notary's account of the execution of a woman named Teofania di Adamo, convicted of poisoning her own husband, Francesco. Here's where the story immediately gets tangled, and it's worth sitting with the tangle rather than smoothing it out, because the tangle is basically the whole point. Di Adamo was executed on the 12th of July, 1633. A contemporary diarist recorded the poison she used under a name that translated comes out roughly as Tofana water. Some historians believe Di Adamo herself invented the formula. Others believe the name actually traces back to her daughter, who allegedly inherited both the business and eventually the legend. And a persistent thread running through generations of retellings claims that daughter's name was Giulia Tofana, the woman this story is popularly built around. There's a problem with that thread, though, and it's a fairly large one. If Giulia Tofana was 13 years old in 1633, which lines up with several traditional birth year estimates, and she is later said to have personally confessed to helping kill 600 men across the following 18 years, you are being asked to believe a teenager built and ran essentially by herself the most successful poison operation in early modern European history. Not impossible, but historians who've actually gone looking for the paperwork have found something considerably messier. Not one poisoner, but several, operating in different cities, in different decades, under a name that seems to have functioned less like a person's identity and more like a brand. Reality check. Known. A woman named Teofania di Adamo was executed in Palermo in 1633 for poisoning her husband, Francesco. And a poison bearing a version of the name Tofana is associated with that case. Known, decades later in Rome, a completely different set of women were tried in 1658 and 1659 for running a poison ring using an apparently similar product. Likely, these cases became merged in the retellings because Aqua Tofana had by then become something closer to a generic term, the way Kleenex became shorthand for tissue, used to describe any slow, undetectable poison, regardless of who actually made it. Still debated whether there ever was a single woman named Giulia Tofana who personally orchestrated all of this, moving from Palermo to Naples to Rome across 3 decades, or whether she is at least partly a composite, a convenient face history gave to a much larger and much less individually dramatic phenomenon. The most rigorous modern account of the Rome case, built from a recently discovered 1,500-page notary transcript that the Vatican had sat on for over 300 years, barely finds Giulia Tofana in the actual courtroom at all. The historian who wrote it, Craig Monson, concludes she most likely died quietly in her sleep around 1651, 8 years before the famous trial, with no one at the time accusing her of anything. Which means the woman this entire legend is named after may well have been dead before the case that made her famous even started. Sit with that for a second, because it's a genuinely strange shape for a piece of history to take. We didn't just get some of the facts wrong, we may have gotten the protagonist wrong. But let's not get ahead of the story. Because whether or not one woman personally masterminded it, something very real absolutely was happening in Rome in the 1650s, and it's worth understanding how it actually worked before we get to how it fell apart. Whoever was actually running it, the product itself was, by 17th century standards, a genuinely elegant piece of engineering. It was based on arsenic, likely combined with lead and belladonna, the same deadly nightshade plant that Italian women were, unrelatedly, already using cosmetically to dilate their pupils into a look considered fashionably alluring. Colorless, odorless, close to tasteless. Sold in small vials, typically labeled as manna of St. Nicholas of Bari, a nod to a genuinely real, genuinely harmless holy oil pilgrims collected from a shrine in southern Italy, often complete with a devotional image of the saint on the bottle. This labeling decision is, honestly, one of the more quietly brilliant pieces of criminal design in this entire story. It didn't just disguise the poison, it weaponized plausible deniability twice over. If a husband found the bottle, it looked like a wife's private religious keepsake or her cosmetic oil, nothing a 17th century man was likely to interrogate. And if authorities ever intercepted it, they'd intercepted what appeared to be an innocuous devotional item sold by street peddlers all over Catholic Italy. Hidden incentive, the dosing itself was engineered around exactly how slow poisoning could be made to look like natural death, which in a city without forensic toxicology meant it effectively was undetectable death. A small first dose produced fatigue and general weakness, easily mistaken for a passing illness. A second dose brought stomach pain, vomiting, and dysentery-like symptoms, plausible in a period where genuine dysentery, cholera, and food poisoning were constantly circulating through Roman streets. By the third or fourth dose, administered over days or weeks, the man was dead, and the symptoms matched what any physician of the period would have already written down as a stomach ailment or a fever. Nobody was running a chemical analysis on a corpse in 1650s Rome. The product wasn't just poison, it was poison specifically calibrated to disappear into the noise of ordinary 17th century mortality. And it wasn't distributed by one woman working alone out of a single apothecary. Contemporary accounts describe something closer to a loose underground guild. Historians estimate at least 200 people operating in Rome's magical and criminal underworld around this period, offering everything from fortune-telling and love potions to lucky charms and, yes, poison. Midwives, alleged witches, a woman who reportedly dispensed poison quietly during Mass and at the public washing streams where women gathered daily to do laundry and apparently discuss their marriages. A supposed priest who may have supplied arsenic through his apothecary-owning brother. Socialites who moved the product into wealthy households their working-class counterparts could never have accessed. Fast fact, it's worth pausing on that washing stream detail, because it tells you something no court record could. The public laundry basin, mundane, daily, entirely female-dominated space, functioned as an informal information network for half of Rome's population. Recipes, gossip, midwifery advice, and evidently poison distribution all moved through the same channel. Historians studying early modern women's social networks have repeatedly found that spaces men considered beneath their notice were often exactly where women exercised the most actual coordinated power. This wasn't a single mastermind's operation, it was a market, and markets, as any economist could tell you, are considerably harder to shut down than individuals. Which brings us to the woman modern research suggests should actually be the center of this story, and whose real biography is, if anything, stranger and sadder than the legend that replaced her. Her name was Gironima Spana, and for over 3 centuries she's been flattened into a stock character, the Wicked Witch at the center of the web, a caricature borrowed wholesale from centuries of European anxiety about women who claimed occult knowledge. The actual archival record, once someone finally sat down and read all 1,500 pages of it, tells a considerably human story. Spana was orphaned young and fled Sicily around age 9. She grew up under the care of a stepfather who, by the accounts that survive, mismanaged what inheritance she had. At 14, she was married off to a man later described as profligate and unfaithful. By the time she surfaces clearly in the historical record as an adult, she has become something else entirely. A renowned Roman psychic, consulted by clients across the city's social hierarchy, mingling, at least at the edges, with Rome's elite. It's worth noticing what kind of woman actually became notorious here, because it's revealing about how reputations get built in a system with almost no formal channels for female authority. Spana didn't rise to prominence through wealth or marriage. She rose through a skill, reading fortunes, offering counsel, being trusted with secrets that operated entirely outside the institutions that were supposed to structure 17th century life. She built, in other words, exactly the kind of informal authority a woman could actually accumulate in a system designed to give her none. And then that same system used her prominence against her the moment things went wrong. Here's the detail that should genuinely surprise you and that most retellings quietly drop. According to Monson's reading of the trial transcript, it's entirely possible Gironima Spana never personally poisoned anyone. She may have been a node, a well-connected, well-known figure other women approached who then connected them to the actual poison makers and dispensers. A hub, not a hand. And yet, she was one of only 6 women hanged out of what appears to have been dozens implicated. Myth. Aqua Tofana was the singular invention and operation of one woman, Giulia Tofana, a criminal mastermind who ran the entire poison trade across Palermo, Naples, and Rome for decades. Verdict. Mostly false, or more precisely, unprovable and probably an oversimplification. Reality. The historical record supports at least 2 and likely 3 or more distinct women and networks operating under a shared name and shared method across different decades and different cities. Teofania di Adamo in 1630s Palermo, a woman remembered as Giulia Tofana, whose actual documented life is thin and whose death likely predates the famous Rome trial by 8 years, and Gironima Spana's genuinely well-documented Rome network of the late 1650s, which the surviving court transcript describes in far greater and far less romantic detail than any of the popular legend. Why the myth became popular? A single glamorous villain is simply a better story than a decentralized, semi-organized underground trade run by dozens of ordinary women, midwives, laundresses, socialites, a psychic, most of whom left almost no individual trace in the historical record. Compressing them into one dramatic character is, essentially, what storytellers have been doing to this case for 3.5 centuries, long before anyone thought to call it content. Evidence. The 2020 rediscovery and analysis of the full 1659 notary transcript, a document long assumed lost, which the Vatican had restricted for generations, allowed historians for the first time to check the popular legend against the actual court record. The two do not match particularly well. So, if it wasn't one woman's genius, how did an underground trade this large, involving this many participants across an entire city, manage to stay hidden for as long as it did? This next part is where the numbers in this story start to genuinely wobble, and it's worth walking through exactly why. The figure most commonly attached to this case, the 600 husbands, appears to originate from a confession allegedly extracted under torture, in which one of the accused claimed the poison had killed that many men across roughly 2 decades. It is, to put it gently, exactly the kind of number you'd expect from a confession obtained under torture, large, unverifiable, and useful to absolutely everyone who heard it. It confirmed the authorities' fear that they were facing a citywide conspiracy. It confirmed popular suspicion that Roman women were quietly, collectively rebelling against their husbands. And later, it made for an unbeatable headline. Reality check. What we can actually document, the 1659 investigation formally examined evidence connected to approximately 46 deaths. Likely, the real number of poisonings connected to this general network across its full span of operation was higher than 46, but almost certainly nowhere near 600. 600 would represent, for context, a meaningful percentage of all adult male deaths in a city of Rome's size across those years, an assertion that strains credibility once you actually do that math, which apparently nobody in 1659 stopped to do. Still debated the true total, because by definition, an undetectable poison leaves no reliable count of its own success. That's rather the entire premise of the product. Myth. Aqua Tofana killed 600 men, a number confirmed by Giulia Tofana's own confession. Verdict: almost certainly a significant exaggeration. Reality: the confirmed investigation centered on roughly 46 deaths. The 600 figure traces back to an unverified confession, likely extracted under torture, a method 17th century Roman courts used routinely, and which modern forensic and legal scholars broadly regard as producing unreliable testimony, since a person being tortured has every incentive to say whatever will end the torture, true or not. Why it stuck: round, enormous numbers travel. 46 confirmed cases within a specific investigation is accurate and forgettable. 600 husbands is a headline that survived 350 years, several centuries before anyone had a word for going viral. Evidence: cross-referencing the surviving trial documentation against the number of deaths formally investigated. Work made possible only once modern historians actually got access to the full case file, rather than relying on second-hand summaries, embellished retellings, and outright inventions that had been circulating since the 17th century. Which brings us naturally to the collapse. If the operation was this decentralized and had apparently been running with some degree of impunity for years, what actually brought it down? Here's where the narrative gets genuinely interesting from a psychological standpoint, because the way this operation unraveled tells you something true about how conspiracies actually fail, as opposed to how they fail in movies. They don't usually get cracked by a brilliant detective. They get cracked by an ordinary person's nerve breaking at exactly the wrong moment. The most commonly repeated account goes like this: a young woman, having purchased the poison with every intention of using it, mixed several drops into her husband's soup, and then, watching him sit down to eat it, lost her nerve completely. She begged him not to touch the bowl, which of course immediately raised the question of why she was begging him not to eat his own dinner. The husband, understandably alarmed, pressed her, got the truth, and went straight to the authorities. A competing theory, less dramatic but perhaps more procedurally plausible, holds that authorities intercepted a courier moving the product between dispensers and clients, and worked backward from there through the network. Reality check. Known: the investigation began in Rome around 1658 and led to a formal trial in 1659. Debated which specific triggering incident actually set it off, since surviving accounts differ, and 17th century legal proceedings routinely folded rumor and courtroom theater into what got recorded as fact. What we can say with more confidence is what happened next, because for that part we finally have the actual court transcript rather than second-hand legend.
Once the investigation opened, it moved fast and wide. Dozens of women were implicated, a striking number of them widows already, women described in the surviving record as of a very ordinary sort. Wives of butchers, barbers, dyers, linen workers, innkeepers. Not glamorous socialites in silk. Working women, the kind of people who don't usually make it into history books at all, except as footnotes to somebody else's story. Here's the detail that should genuinely unsettle you more than the poisoning itself, because it says something uncomfortable about how justice actually distributes itself, then and arguably now. Dozens of women were implicated. A meaningful number of them appear, from the surviving testimony, to have actually poisoned their husbands, and yet only 6 were hanged. Some of the accused faced serious punishment, despite having no clear direct role in any death, Gironima Spana most notably, whose actual hands-on guilt remains genuinely unclear even now. Others, who by their own or others' testimony had directly administered poison, were never even formally interrogated. Psychology breakdown, or honestly, a sociology breakdown.
Why would a justice system built around punishing exactly this crime let so many actual poisoners walk free while hanging a woman whose direct guilt is uncertain? The most persuasive explanation modern historians have offered isn't mysterious once you say it out loud. Social position, class, connection. A widow with powerful clients, useful information about half of Roman high society, or simply better legal representation had genuinely different odds than a butcher's wife with none of those things. The Roman justice system of 1659 wasn't purely or even primarily sorting people by evidence of guilt. It was sorting them, at least in part, by how expensive and how socially costly it would be to prosecute them. That's not a uniquely 17th century observation, incidentally. It's just unusually well documented in this particular case, because we happen to have the paperwork. Fast fact: the execution site itself carries a quiet irony worth sitting with. Campo di Fiori, where the 5 women were hanged, had been Rome's public execution ground for generations, the same square where the philosopher and former friar Giordano Bruno was burned in 1600 for a set of ideas the Church considered dangerously unorthodox. Rome, it turns out, had one favorite stage for making an example of people who'd disturbed the established order, whether the disturbance was cosmological or marital. Not every account of this era ends in punishment, and it's worth noting the outliers because they complicate the villainous gets-what-coming-to-her framing that later retellings loved to lean on. Some women implicated in poisoning cases across this period, including some connected to related trials, were investigated and released, or never brought to trial at all despite what appears from surviving records to be reasonably strong evidence against them. Historians studying these gaps have suggested that authorities occasionally seemed less interested in punishing every poisoner than in publicly demonstrating that the threat had been dealt with, a handful of hangings functioning as a kind of civic reassurance, regardless of how thoroughly the underlying trade had actually been dismantled. Which, if true, tells you something quietly important. The 1659 executions may have been less about eliminating the poison trade and more about restoring the appearance of order. 2 very different goals that a public hanging can apparently be made to serve equally well. Let's step back from the courtroom for a moment, because it's worth asking the question the narrator in you has probably already been circling. Why did this particular criminal product become such an enduring legend when plenty of other poisoners from this era have been almost entirely forgotten? Here's a theory, and it has less to do with the poison itself than with what it represented.
Aqua Tofana wasn't just a weapon. It was, in a very real sense, the 17th century's most efficient piece of technology for solving a problem the entire legal and religious system refused to acknowledge existed: that a woman trapped in a genuinely unbearable, often violent marriage had no legitimate exit. The church offered none. The courts offered almost none. Her own family, having already spent the dowry, often had every financial incentive not to take her back. Modern connection. It's worth noting that this story hasn't stayed comfortably in the past. In the mid-2020s, in the wake of a contentious American election that raised fresh anxieties about reproductive rights, a wave of women online began invoking Giulia Tofana's name, half joking, half pointed, as shorthand for exactly this same underlying frustration: the gap between what the law permits and what a woman trapped in an unbearable situation actually needs. Nobody involved was seriously suggesting 17th century arsenic cocktails as 21st century policy, but the fact that a 17th century poison peddler's name could resurface, unprompted, as a piece of modern political shorthand almost 400 years later tells you the underlying grievance never fully went away. It just changed its available remedies. That's not an endorsement of poisoning anyone then or now worth saying explicitly. It's an observation about why a story like this refuses to fade, because the emotional logic underneath it, trapped, unheard, and offered one quiet, terrible option, kept being recognizable to people who'd never even use arsenic. Myth: Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was poisoned with Aqua Tofana over a century after the original poison ring was broken up. Verdict: false, and this one has an unusually well-documented origin. Reality: in 1791, as Mozart grew seriously ill in the final months of his life, he reportedly voiced his own suspicion that he'd been poisoned, and Aqua Tofana's reputation was apparently vivid enough, more than a century later, that his mind went there specifically. Modern medical historians overwhelmingly attribute his death to natural causes, most likely a streptococcal infection leading to rheumatic fever or a related kidney complication, based on his documented symptoms. Why the myth became popular? It was Mozart himself who planted the rumor, which gives it a rare kind of durability. A suspicion voiced by the dying man about his own death carries an emotional weight that later corrections struggle to overcome, no matter how solid the medical evidence. Evidence: biographical and medical scholarship on Mozart's final illness, cross-referenced against his own physician's contemporaneous notes, shows a symptom pattern consistent with infectious disease rather than heavy metal poisoning, and entirely inconsistent with the slow, deliberate dosing Aqua Tofana was known for. Myth: there was ever a reliable antidote to Aqua Tofana, commonly claimed to be a mixture of vinegar and lemon juice. Verdict: false, or at best, unproven. Reality: vinegar and citrus remedies for poisoning were a fairly generic folk treatment across early modern Europe, applied to all sorts of suspected toxins, with essentially no scientific mechanism that would counteract arsenic, lead, or belladonna specifically. There's no credible evidence it saved anyone from a genuine sustained dose. Why it stuck? Every poison narrative wants a countermeasure. It makes the danger feel manageable rather than absolute, which is a more comfortable story to pass down. A slow poison with no known cure is a genuinely bleak thing to sit with. A slow poison with a folk remedy antidote, however unreliable, is a story you can tell your children without quite as much dread. Evidence: no 17th century medical or toxicological source describes a verified case of successful treatment, and modern toxicology confirms that arsenic poisoning, particularly cumulative dosing of the kind Aqua Tofana relied on, has no meaningful home remedy. It's worth pausing on the economics here, because "She Married for Money" undersells how mechanical the whole arrangement actually was.
A dowry in 17th century Rome wasn't a romantic gesture. It was often the largest financial transaction a family would ever make, sometimes representing years of accumulated savings, occasionally financed through loans that a family would spend a decade repaying. Once paid, it typically became the husband's to manage, invested, spent, gambled, or simply absorbed into his household, with the wife holding at best a theoretical claim to its return if the marriage dissolved. In practice, that claim was almost never worth pursuing, because pursuing it meant taking your own husband to an ecclesiastical court that was structurally going to be more sympathetic to him than to you. This is why a genuinely useless husband was such a specific kind of financial catastrophe, rather than simply an emotional one. A man who drank, gambled, or mismanaged the family's money wasn't just making his wife unhappy, he was actively burning through capital she had no legal mechanism to protect, in a household she had no legal mechanism to leave, with children she had no legal mechanism to independently support if she somehow did leave anyway. Economic breakdown, widowhood, flipped this arrangement almost entirely.
A widow in this period could, depending on local law and her late husband's will, regain control of her original dowry, inherit a portion of the estate, and, crucially, legally manage property and finances in her own name for the first time in her adult life. She could also, if she chose, decline to remarry at all, something an unmarried adult daughter living under her father's roof essentially could not do. None of this made widowhood comfortable. Many widows in this period were left in genuine poverty, but it was, structurally, the only life stage in which a Roman woman held anything resembling financial agency, which is precisely why so many of the women implicated in this case were either widows or were about to become so. Put those two facts next to each other, a marriage a woman couldn't exit and a widowhood that finally handed her some control, and the demand for a product like Aqua Tofana stops looking mysterious. It starts looking like the predictable output of a system that had built exactly one narrow doorway toward female independence, and then acted baffled when women started finding their way to it by whatever means were actually available to them. There's a reason this legend took root in Italy rather than, say, England or the Dutch Republic during the same century, and it's not simply that Italian women were more desperate. Plenty of women across early modern Europe were trapped in comparably unbearable marriages. Part of the answer is reputational, and it predates this case by generations. By the mid-17th century, Italy and Italian courts and apothecaries in particular had already developed a broad European reputation as unusually sophisticated in matters of poison. Whether or not that reputation was fully earned, it was widely believed across the continent, and belief itself did real work here. It meant that when a slow, undetectable poison did surface in Rome, it slotted into a story Europe was already primed to find plausible. Nobody needed convincing that Italians might know more about poison than anyone else. They'd been telling each other that for decades. The other part of the answer is structural, and it's the piece already discussed, the near-total absence of divorce, enforced by a church with enormous civic authority in a city that was quite literally the seat of that church. Rome wasn't just a city with a poison problem. It was the specific city where papal authority made the legal exits from a bad marriage narrowest, and where, not coincidentally, one of early modern Europe's most notorious poison trades took root. Here's the thing that gets lost every time this story gets compressed into a 5-minute video about a wicked poisoner. This was never really a story about one villain. It was a story about an entire city's plumbing.
Underneath the legend sits an actual functioning underground economy. Arsenic sourced through an apothecary's back door, courtesy of a supposed priest with the right family connections, distribution through midwives, laundry day gossip networks, and society intermediaries. A product engineered specifically to exploit the total absence of 17th century forensic science, and a customer base drawn from every rung of Roman society, from butchers' wives to duchesses, all solving in the only way available to them a problem the law simply refused to touch. Technology breakdown, briefly. It's worth appreciating, clinically, just how sophisticated the actual product design was for its era. Slow-acting, symptom profile matching common natural illness, disguised inside packaging that exploited genuine religious tourism, dosed specifically to avoid the kind of dramatic, fast death that would draw suspicion. Someone, whether one woman or several, had effectively reverse-engineered the exact forensic and social blind spots of 17th century Rome and built a product to live inside them. That's not folklore, that's applied expertise, developed and refined by trial and error, almost certainly over years, almost certainly by more than one mind.
And once you see it that way, the one brilliant evil woman framing starts to look less like history and more like a coping mechanism, a way for a deeply patriarchal legal system to explain away an uncomfortable truth that dozens, possibly hundreds of ordinary women across an entire city had independently arrived at the same desperate solution to the same structural problem, and the system's response was to hang a handful of them and call the matter closed. So what do you actually do with a story like this? One where even the protagonist might not have existed the way we've always been told, where the death toll was probably inflated by a factor of 10 or more, where the woman most famously punished may not have personally done the thing she was punished for, and where the solution the authorities settled on was 6 public hangings that left the underlying problem and, quite possibly, most of the actual poisoners completely untouched. Here's what I keep landing on. We like our history populated by masterminds because masterminds are satisfying. A single brilliant villain gives you someone to blame, and once you've blamed them, the story is over. The world apparently returns to normal the moment they're punished. But almost nothing about the Aqua Tofana case actually works that way. It wasn't one woman's genius, it was hundreds of ordinary people, laundresses, midwives, butchers' widows, a psychic who may never have poisoned anyone at all, independently reaching the same conclusion about the same broken system, using the same handful of ingredients, disguised in the same kind of bottle. That's a far less comfortable story than one wicked woman got what she deserved. It's a story about a legal and religious structure that offered women for generations exactly one meaningfully effective private remedy for an unbearable marriage, and then treated the 6 women executed for supplying it as a satisfying, tidy ending, rather than as a symptom of the very system that made the demand for it inevitable in the first place. History isn't strange because the people in it were unusually cruel, or unusually clever, or unusually different from us. History is strange because the people in it were almost exactly like us, reasonable people, working within the rules they'd actually been given, arriving at conclusions that look horrifying from 350 years away and look to them simply like the only door left unlocked. If you want more videos like this, subscribe.